Welcome to Majoring in the Majors with Pastor S.J. Munson on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are podcasts. You can find them at artistfirst.com. Your host is the author of 2 books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, The Hijacking of American Christianity. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Pastor S.J. Munson.
Many climate deniers consider global warming or climate change as an issue that merely affects polar bears and penguins. But with alarming extinction rates, catastrophic fires, floods, and hurricanes, it's already clear that our children and grandchildren will be living in a world substantially different from what we are used to, a world that will challenge or may even threaten the very existence of our species. Here to talk about these and other issues is Dr. Elizabeth Cripps, PhD, who is a writer, philosopher, mother and activist, and senior lecturer in political theory at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. She's the author of popular philosophy books such as What Climate Justice Means and Why We Should Care, and her recent book, Parenting on Earth, A Philosopher's Guide to Doing Right by Your Kids and Everyone Else. Dr. Elizabeth Cripps, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, as a philosopher, how did you get interested in not only tackling climate justice as an issue, but also approaching it from the perspective of parenting? Can you tell us about your journey there?
Absolutely. So I've been thinking about climate justice as an academic for a long time. It's been an issue that's been close to my heart and one that I did my PhD on, and that I've researched a lot around kind of climate ethics and individual duties and global justice for the last 15 or so years. And then when I had children, which was just under 10 years ago, my first child was born, it became incredibly personal. So this topic, which I already knew mattered morally, became a really sort of salient personal concern for me as well. And that kind of got me into this very rich literature in philosophy on this question of what we owe our children. And it became for me this kind of personal as well as philosophical challenge to figure out, well, how can you be a good parent? What should we be doing for our children when the future that they face is so fragile and so dangerous?
Now, your title is intriguing, Parenting on Earth, A Philosopher's Guide to Doing Right by Your Kids and Everyone Else. Why did you choose that title?
Because, Parenting on Earth, to bring out, I think, the fact that one of the key challenges, it's not the only kind of global challenge that we face at the moment, but one of the key challenges that we face is climate change. Some of the other major challenges that our children will face, things like antibiotic resistance, the threat of pandemic, are also tied up in the way that we interact with the rest of the world, with non-human species, with ecosystems. So it seemed to me really important when we were thinking about the title to kind of bring out that link. And the sort of philosopher's guide is to emphasize that this isn't a conventional parenting manual. It's about this sort of bigger question of how do we make sense of what we should be doing for our children, and how do we fit that into this question of, well, what should we be doing more generally for everyone else in a world that is this messed up?
Well, speaking of philosophy, how does your background in philosophy as a discipline inform or influence your particular take on these issues?
I think it's absolutely key to the way I think about it. I mean, it's interesting for me writing the book because I write it partly as a philosopher, but partly I used to be a journalist, so I was using that to interview other academics, to interview activists, to sort of draw on a much sort of wider range of experience than just my own. But I was also writing it as a parent, as a mother, so it's a kind of real blend of those three. But the philosophy is crucial. I mean, this moral question essentially is what responsibilities do we have to other people, and in particular, what special duties do we have to our own children because they're our children? So I was kind of starting from that, and there's obviously a lot of agreement in philosophy, a lot of consensus on some kind of core starting points there, and then I was going from there and saying, well, look, if we're going to accept that we owe our children anything, we have to accept that we owe them a safe world, a safe future, that if we don't try and do that for them as parents, then we're essentially making a mockery of everything else we do for them. So the philosophy was key for me. The moral aspect is really important.
So a lot of logic involved in it as well. What you mentioned in your book that being a good parent also means being a good ancestor. Could you kind of unpack what you mean by that?
Yes. So when we think about what we owe our own children, I think it's tempting to think just in terms of what we owe them here and now as children. And I'm a mum, I completely know how much of our time that takes up, just kind of caring for the here and now. And then we also think in terms of what we can do to shore them up for their adulthood, to enable them to grow up, to do well in their society. But I think often, especially in the global north, there's a real tendency to think of that in terms of things like economic opportunities, financial prospects, careers. And actually, I think we need to think about that much broadly. We need to think about what our children actually need to lead a full or flourishing life. And part of that is going to be bound up in what the prospects are for their children, for our grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Because if we think about how much it means to us as parents that our children have a chance at a decent future, and then sort of take that kind of dilemma that we face, this fear that we face for our children's future, the dilemma that many people have about whether to have children at all now, and think about how much worse things will be when our children are adults. I don't think we can separate this question of what it means to be a good parent from, well, what are the prospects that would face any children that our children had. And actually some philosophers, and I talk about this in the book, kind of think that iterates so that we can't, because it's going to be integral to whether I can lead a full life, whether my children are able to do so. It's going to matter. It's going to be a really important part of whether their lives go well, whether if they have children, if their lives can go well. And if we go on sort of down through the generations, then ultimately you end up saying, well, we can't separate this question. Being a good parent means thinking about the future that our more distant descendants will also have.
You talk about two assumptions that parents make, especially in affluent society. One is that their children will be living in a world pretty much like the one we're living in today, without a lot of food insecurity or wars over natural resources like water, or basically, business as usual. And the other is that governments and institutions like the World Health Organization, or even science, I guess, in general, are somehow going to sort all this out by the time it really reaches, existential threat. Why do you feel these are false assumptions?
Well, what's happening at the moment is that we have these clear-cut global challenges. The climate change is in many ways the most obvious. That the IPCC is sort of screaming out warnings now, saying, look, this is going to be really bad, and it's actually going to be really bad within the lifetime of our children. But there is still a window to do something about this. So this is essentially scientific consensus on the fact that now that assumption that it's tempting to make as parents that, well, our children will grow up in a reasonably safe society, and we just have to worry about the details of how well equipped they are to flourish in that society as parents, which is a very privileged thing to be able to assume anyway, by the way. But even sort of in the affluent world, we now can't make that assumption. And I think the other reason that we probably, do need to take a much wider approach to thinking about what it means to be a good parent is that the other assumption I think we make is that, well, yes, of course, our children need an environment in which they can flourish. They need a society which will provide them with reasonable security and so on. But we just assume that it's the government's job to provide that, so that it's not up to parents to have to do this. But unfortunately, governments aren't doing that. They are not acting with anything like the speed required on challenges like climate change. And once we're in that situation, I think it does sort of fall back on parents who do have these special duties to their children. We shouldn't necessarily be parents that are having to do this, but if governments aren't protecting our children, and there's a lot that we can achieve by working together through activism, through political work, I think we do have to get political as parents. It becomes unavoidable.
So you talk about how the world's collective failure to adequately address climate crises, climate change, has effectively changed the rules of the game for us as parents, and that it's now sort of a tag we're it, it's up to us to address these issues. You go as far to say that not addressing these issues as parents is like reading a bedtime story to our kids while the house is burning down. Can you talk more about that?
Yes, so this is, when we think about what we need to do for our children, what we owe for them, what we think it means to be a good parent, I think something that we tend to think sort of generally a kind of common sense view, but also what a lot of philosophers come up with on this is the idea that, well, part of it is looking after your child, keeping them healthy, letting them play, and all the other things that they need when they're children, but it's also about educating them, teaching them to grow up autonomous and able to play a part in the society, to do well in the society they'll grow up in. And there are things that we do that are part of that, and one kind of core sort of parenting activity is reading bedtime stories. But what I'm trying to say is that if we think we should do all those things because we think that parents should care about their children's future, that being a good parent doesn't only mean thinking about what they have at the moment, it means thinking about what they're going to have in the future, then we have to say, well, look, if the society they're going to grow up in is going to face all these serious threats, and we could collectively do something about that, then we absolutely need to. If we don't, then we are essentially making a mockery of all the things that we're doing to prepare them to be the kind of person who could flourish as an adult, if we're not doing anything to ensure that they have a kind of safe future society and world in which they can do that flourishing, they can live that adulthood. And that's where the analogy comes in. If the house is on fire, you don't just sit there reading bedtime stories in it, you do your best to put it out.
So how are we to go about this? You write about 3 climate change duties that we have as parents, and I'd like to talk about them one by one because there's so much to say in each. The first one is making lifestyle changes to minimize our carbon footprint. What are we talking about here? Someone might say, what's the point if the world is collapsing? Why even bother?
Good. So, and I think I completely understand where that concern comes from, because I think there's a real danger in making this all about individuals and individual families being expected to change their lives. The reason that things aren't being solved on these problems is because of the failure of governments and corporations to tackle these challenges. Ultimately, this has to be done collectively, which is why I think the most important thing that parents should be doing, which we'll talk about in a minute, is trying to promote that kind of collective change, becoming kind of activists. But I do think that changing the way we live as families is a really important part of it. I mean, partly because actually this can be one way of promoting social change, being part of a movement to live differently, to live in, for example, a lower carbon way, can be important. It can also send an important message as part of campaigning that actually, you're prepared to put your money where your mouth is, so to speak. But there are also some reasons which I think are specific to parents here, and that is that if we think about what we're doing to our children, if we don't try and sort of, if you like, detach them from these collectively harmful ways of life, then we're making it much harder for them in the future. We're sort of helping them to grow up, to become hooked on exactly the kind of ways of thinking and living which have led to these collective catastrophes. And I think that's a sort of additional reason why for parents, so everyone should has a reason to change their lifestyles. It's not the most important thing, but it matters because, it's part of avoiding being complicit in harm or promoting a collective change. But for parents, there is this additional thing, which is enabling our children not to become hooked on something which is ultimately so bad for them and everyone else. And incidentally, a lot of the sort of changes that I talk about in the book, things like active travel and some diet changes or more engagement with the natural world, so more time in nature, less sort of consumer goods focus, all of those are actually have documented benefits, whether in health or mental health, for children anyway.
So let's get into more details about what kinds of things, kind of a practical guide of what kinds of things parents can do. Where would you start in this area of change?
So I think in terms of deciding what to do, it's a bigger decision, because also thinking about, how is this going to fit into other changes that I want to make to be more involved in activism or to involve my children in that. And obviously there are limited resources, and there's a chapter in the book where I talk about, how we kind of try and balance things out and make difficult choices. But ultimately, we can start with things like, again, focus on climate change, the fact that actually there are some lifestyle choices like around flying, or driving, or eating lots of meat and dairy that have this kind of proven significant carbon footprint. They're sort of obvious places to start. But there are also the sort of the detachment as far as possible. Again, it's really difficult. I'm a parent. I completely get that it's really difficult. Trying not to bring our children up in too kind of consumerist a mindset, because actually that's been shown, not only is it a serious contributor to these environmental challenges, but it's also actually been shown to be really bad, for example, for teenagers, for their mental health, the way in which their identity can just become bound up in the things that they have and buy. So I think that there are things that we can choose to do that are actually not only going to be part of shifting away from this way of life which is causing harm, but actually also can be immediately kind of individually good for our children as well.
Now, another thing you mentioned is to raise kids who are good ecological citizens, aware of global climate injustices and things like that. Could you talk more about that?
Absolutely. So yes, I put it broadly. So yes, good ecological, but also good global citizens. So this is about raising children who are aware of the crisis, the dangers that they face around things like climate change, but also have a kind of justice lens on that. So raising children who are aware of the sort of racist and gender-based injustices which are embedded in their institutions, and actually also embedded in the way that we reach and respond to a challenge like climate change. So it's about raising children who essentially are, at a very basic level, this is just about raising decent human beings. So it's around raising children who recognize other humans as humans and respond to that appropriately. And it's about raising children who see how dependent they are on and how much they are a part of the sort of non-human world, the sort of complex systems that make up our natural world. And I think that's particularly important because society pushes our children to be the reverse. So society is teaching our children to be super consumeristic. It's teaching them to do, as we've been taught to do, to think of a non-human world as a commodity, as a resource to be used. So I think teaching children to kind of shift away from that mindset, if they are children in certain social groups, teaching them to recognize their privilege and to be allies. And it's also about sort of educating them about climate change, not in a way that scares them, but in a way that will empower them as they become adults.
And the third thing is that we need, as parents, to become climate activists. What does that look like, and how does one get started with that?
So there are many, many things that this could look like. So this is activism understood in a very broad way. This is simply a recognition of the fact that, as you were saying, at the start of your line of questions then, just that changing my life as an individual, changing your life as a family is not going to be enough on its own. This has to be a collective change. What we need is collective action. We can't, as individual parents, we're not in a position now to protect our own children's future on our own, but we can do an enormous amount together by working together as parents and also with other activist and social justice and global justice groups. And because we have a big political voice, we also have a big economic voice, which we can use taken together. So it's about being an activist, and that can certainly mean sort of more conventional forms of activism. So protests. I mean, I was at the climate protests in London a couple of weeks ago. I didn't take my children that time, but I quite often take them with me on climate protests. And there are lots of parent activist groups which people can be part of. But there's also sort of the more general things that we can do to use our political voice, targeting, speaking to our representatives and politicians, using the networks that we have as parents anyway to talk about this, to communicate the need for action on these problems. There are many different things that we can do. There's also one thing that parent groups have been doing recently is really targeting those big financial firms that are fossil fuel enablers. So for example, Lloyd's of London, the big insurer, sort of trying to persuade them to stop insuring fossil fuel projects. So there's a lot of different ways in which this activism can be done. And some of it can use parents' networks specifically, or can try and speak to decision makers as parents themselves to appeal to that kind of really powerful thing that we share, which is that we all really care about what happens to our own children. We love them, but I think it's a very wide range of things, and it will depend on what parents have most skills and capacity to do. I mean, somebody might be an amazing communicator, somebody else might not feel so comfortable communicating, but have more financial resources that they're happy to donate to environmental movements. There are all sorts of different ways in which people can do this.
I think sometimes it may start with just something as simple as signing a petition, and when you sign a petition online, sometimes you get into this loop, or this group, where they start informing you about activities and things, other things that are going on, related issues, events that are happening. Sometimes you can find events in your local area, and you find that, there is stuff going on. I just wasn't aware about it. We've been in our own little worlds, surviving day to day without thinking there are other parents who have begun this journey and, need our support. I have I'll talk to you about my individual family. Maybe you can help me, counsel me. I have a child still at home, a young teenager. And a few years ago, I sat my family down and said, look, we need to start doing something to change the way we're living. We do not have good leadership in this country, especially in regard to climate change, or in the world in general. So, basically we're it's up to us. We've got to do something. So we need to talk about what we can do about the kind of car we drive, about the kind of food we eat, what we can do with the property that we live on, things that we can grow. How can we help people who are more severely impacted by climate change now? And I was disappointed that it was greeted with a profound silence. I shouldn't have been surprised, I think, but part of that was probably just the nature of being, a teenager. But I decided, I just need to start taking action myself, and just start doing it. How do you get others to follow? How do you get others to? It's hard to motivate people, but how do you do that? I look at someone like Greta Thunberg and think, wow,
yes.
I wish I had a child like that. Is that realistic?
So I think it's really interesting you saying that, because there's obviously, as you mentioned, Greta Thunberg there's also kind of a lot of examples of it happening the other way, of children and teenagers themselves being the ones to kind of motivate their parents to take action. I talk about this a bit in the book, and then draw on the work, for example, of Katharine Hayhoe, who's an amazing climate scientist and communicator. And she talks about the importance of engaging people by starting with something they care about, making it real for them, motivating it for them, pointing out the kind of the dangers that their immediate community will face, or something that that matters to them. So she talks about, talking to bird watchers about what climate change will do to bird species, talking to, farmers about what it will do to weather patterns in their area and so on, getting people kind of more immediately engaged on that level. Another reason I think that a lot of people don't act isn't because they don't care, it's because they're scared. I mean, that's definitely a factor with young people. And it's interesting that there was a survey, I think it was the Yale Climate Communications have done a study of attitudes in the US, you've probably seen it, to climate change, and they've done it over a number of years. And they sort of have at the one extreme the people who are really active and concerned and taking action, and then at the other extreme the people who are dismissive, who are essentially climate deniers. But the climate deniers are only, less than 10% of the population, and everyone in between at some kind of various level of thinking it's important but not doing anything about it, or think it's important but thinking other things are as or more important. So actually, most people, with a few exceptions, most people, there will be scope for kind of engaging them. That there is recognition that this is an important issue. And so I think a lot of it is about communication, sharing fears, trying to get past those psychological hurdles which often stop people from thinking about it.
Now, this is a tough issue, but you do raise this issue in your book, the inevitable question, in the light of these challenges and the potential collapse of Western civilization: should we be having children at all?
So yeah, I mean, this is a really. I decided to include it in the book in the end because although this is about what we owe to our children, and so is particularly appealing to those people who've had children, I think it's also, for many young people, this is a really relevant question. It's a question that they are actually asking themselves, which is, well, should we be having children at all? And philosophers have thought about this and engaged with this. So I thought it was important to do that in the book. And I think, so there are two reasons, at least two, actually I think there's a third, but there's at least two reasons why we might think the answer is no. One of them is because having children, especially in a society like mine in the UK or yours in the States, is that it is one of the biggest ways of increasing our own carbon impact. So if we think that one of the things, so it's not the most important thing we should be doing, is cutting our own carbon impact, then that's the fact that is a very high impact decision is potentially a reason not to have children or not to have any children. And the other reason, of course, is just fear of what those children would face. And with the first one, what I say in the book is that yes, this is a moral reason to take it seriously, just as we should be, thinking seriously about reasons, not to fly or not to drive. The fact that this is one way in which we do significantly increase carbon emissions is a reason to think about it. But to stress this too much makes it too much about individuals, and again kind of neglects the fact that the problem is collective. So yes, I think this is something that people should be taking into consideration, but given what a huge sacrifice it would be for many people not to have children, given how incredibly important this family relationship is, the experience of parenting, to ask people to give it up is actually asking a huge sacrifice. And given that what's needed to tackle climate change is really collective action, I think it's too sort of simplistic to draw the conclusion, well, we just shouldn't be having children because children are a way in which as individuals we increase carbon impact. I mean, I think it's a factor to take into consideration in deciding family size, but there's no kind of neat, clear-cut answer on that one. I mean, and in the book I talk about how I just don't feel that I should be dictating to other individuals on this who will have different kind of reasons for valuing different family size. I talk about the kind of decision that we made to stop at 2 children for precisely that reason, when otherwise we would have definitely would have liked to have more. But it is a very personal decision, I think. But the other reason, this reason that we're really genuinely worried about what children who are born now would face, I think, is hugely worrying for many young people. I mean, I think it's also, again, worth recognizing that to some extent it's a sign of our privilege that we're realizing this now. I mean, for many, many generations, over many periods in history, different communities, often communities of color, have been, facing this fear for what their children would face. But it's now that the sort of more affluent white societies are realizing it's a threat to them. So I think there's something important about recognizing that privilege. But nonetheless, this is a really genuine worry for young people. And I think what I think we need to think about on that is, well, is it a binary choice? This is where I think the idea of hope comes in. It doesn't have to be don't have children or have children and leave them a terrible future, because there is this third option, which is if we have children, do everything we can working together as parents to ensure that they will have a decent future. So it's about kind of earning hope for them, being part of what it means to be a parent. And that's why I think for me the most important thing is what we do for our children and what it matters that we do for our children once we do have them. I mean, there's also the fact that we another factor which isn't talked about as much in thinking about family size as well, we only have limited time and resources. So if we're actually being a good parent also is going to mean being a climate activist, then we're going to have less time to do that if we have more children. That was another reason for some activists give for having a smaller family. But ultimately, I think that the important question is what should we be doing for the children that we do have.
And related to that, you bring up another option in your book about adopting a child who's already here or on the way, perhaps from a group or community that's being impacted, by climate change or other the threats that face us. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and that's an incredibly valuable thing to do, and it's also an amazing parent-child relationship. I mean, you can have that incredibly valuable relationship with an adoptive child. Of course you can. I think there is nonetheless a sort of worry in saying, well, so that's fine, so we don't need to have our own biological children, because there are a lot of reasons why people might still value being able to have their own biological children, whether it's to do with this idea of a kind of sense of immortality, passing on the genes and the traits of oneself or the people you love, or also just sort of the experience, particularly for women, of having a child, of going through that process of being pregnant, of giving birth, of breastfeeding, which is for many a very kind of valued and valuable experience. So while I think the parent-child relationship and the deep value from it, yes, we can have that with an adopted child, I would be worried about therefore sort of concluding that there's no kind of significant loss or sacrifice in not going through that biological process as well.
Here's a question that I ask most of our guests, particularly pertinent in this conversation. Are you hopeful or even optimistic about our children's future?
I want to build hope for my children's future. So I don't want to be hopeful in the kind of passive sense that says, oh, scientists will sort it out, or even, look at the young activists, they're so amazing, they'll sort it out. It's not their job to sort it out. But I am hopeful about what we can still do, what people acting together, what parents acting together can do to change this. And I think, as a parent, I don't think you could afford not to be hopeful, right? Because it matters so much what the future of our children faces. So much kind of hangs on it personally as well as kind of morally. And I think, yes, there are things that make me hopeful. Being part of the movement, working with other incredible parent activists, that gives me hope. But I don't want to sort of sit back and say it'll all be fine in a kind of passive optimism kind of way, because that's just not going to work.
You mentioned how philosophy or even psychology as disciplines can really help us tackle these threats. It's not something we think of the climate crisis as being a environmental issue for environmental scientists and so forth. But how do philosophers and psychologists get involved in this? What is their role, do you think?
So this this is a moral crisis, and I think part of the reason that we haven't had sufficient action on climate change is a sort of failure to recognise that. It's also because of the sort of socio-psychological obstacles that we face that we need to recognise and move through. That's why I think those disciplines are so important. But I think if climate change is a technical challenge, it's a scientific challenge, it's an economic, it's a hugely political challenge, it's all of those things. But it is also, at this basic level, a moral crisis. It's a failure to protect the lives of millions of humans, including our own children. And that is just whatever your moral, philosophical view, that is a serious problem. The fact that we are, living in a way which is collectively not just failing to protect, but actually harming huge numbers of humans, including our own children and potential grandchildren, that it makes it a moral crisis. And I think recognizing that is absolutely crucial. In terms of kind of turning that into action, climate psychology is absolutely crucial to kind of recognize the reasons why we're not making progress and to understand the tools that we need to move forward. I mean, that's why I'm not a psychologist, but it was really important to me in the last chapter of the book to do a kind of deep dive into climate psychology, to interview psychologists as well as activists, and to really kind of build up a kind of toolkit of ways in which we can try and move ourselves past that in order to be part of a movement and a way forward. So I think that they're absolutely crucial. I mean, the science is incredibly important too, and the climate science, there's a huge amount of consensus on it. A lot of it is just that people haven't actually acted on it sufficiently politically. But yes, I think that the philosophy and the psychology are absolutely crucial too.
Well, speaking of that, could you talk about what were your findings in delving into what you call climate psychology? Why have we made so little progress? I mean, certainly we could think about, economic, control by, big corporations and things like that, but certainly there are other issues involved as well.
Yes, so I mean, this is psychologically hard to do. So if we think about the sort of position of an individual who's trying to balance their own life with thinking about this, we are wired to think about things in a short-term way, to increasingly value everything by sort of economic worth that is assigned, this label that is given to it. We are encouraged by society, by the media, towards being very kind of materialistic and to feel both sort of detached from the non-human world, and to think about it as something that is just a resource to be exploited. So all of these, I think, are reasons why we don't act on climate change. We're also, scared. But the fact that they are reasons doesn't make them justification. So we say, right, fine. So we know that we should be doing this. We know that we're not doing this, and this is one of the reasons. So that should push us to look at the psychology itself and say, well, look, how do we move beyond this? And climate psychologists talk a lot about the importance of recognizing the really difficult emotions that are going on here, that climate change gives rise to, acknowledging them to ourselves and to each other, talking about them, trying to move through them and recognize them, because if otherwise what we do essentially is we carry on in this kind of constant process of disavowal and trying to know something but carry on our lives as though we didn't know it, and do these kind of constant mental gymnastics to try and avoid this essentially state of being really scared. So working through these emotions is really important and really key, and kind of being open about that. And I think working with others, this kind of solidarity and community of being part of movements can be really helpful there. It's also about finding ways to break this kind of short-termism in the way that we think. And actually parents have a bit of a head start on that, because we do care about our children. We care about their future. So for example, I talk about the Dear Tomorrow project, which is this project which involves both a website and a display that was in various different places, where essentially they have parents write letters to their children in 30 years, 40 years time, and they get or people to write to their own selves in the future. But that exercise of, I talk about in the end of the book trying to do it myself and how difficult I found it. The exercise of trying to write to your future children and really think about what life might be like for them in say 2050 is really is really kind of motivating and revealing, the problems of short-term thinking. Now, of course, to move beyond that, to think about the much longer term, we need to sort of find deeper time ways of thinking, but this can definitely be a start. And then there's also a huge amount that we can do to kind of rebuild our connect with the non-human world, to become better at kind of observing and being in nature rather than just trying to move on to the next consumer good as quickly as we can. And that can also be really an important part of raising and helping our children. So I think they go together. The other thing I talk about is the need to kind of cultivate self-care, but to separate that, so to recognize that this is psychologically really demanding and we do need to look after ourselves. We're in this for the long haul, but this isn't self-care in the kind of commoditized way it's become. This is about kind of recognizing what we need and needing time out or friends, allies in the community, time, going for a walk or something, but recognizing what we need and making sure that we carve out space to have that as individuals. So yeah, those are the things that I kind of pull out of the psychology. There's also a lot of really interesting psychological work on what we need to do together to keep going, is to motivate each other in groups.
Well, thank you so much. It's been so informative. We've been talking with Dr. Elizabeth Cripps, PhD, who is a senior lecturer in political theory at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. She's a philosopher, mother, and activist, and she's written several books on climate justice. Her most recent is Parenting on Earth, A Philosopher's Guide to Doing Right by Your Kids and Everyone Else. I firmly recommend this book, whether you're a parent with children at home or you're thinking about having kids, or even if you don't have children but just want to leave the planet a better place. I highly recommend this book. It's very informative, provocative. It will provoke you to think and hopefully provoke you to action as well. Dr. Cripps, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been great.
Thank you for making time for us. And this is Pastor S.J. Munson thanking you for tuning in, and I'm signing off.